Hello, my name is Joshua Griever, and I would like to welcome you to this brief video on how to interpret the Bible. In this video, I want to explain three things. First, the challenge of interpreting the Bible. Second, I will explain the basic principles that biblical interpreters use when they read and study the biblical text. And then third, I will provide you with some resources to help you interpret the Bible in better and more accurate ways for yourself. So let's dive in. First, there are a number of challenges to interpreting the Bible. The Bible is not always an easy book to understand. There are certain parts of the Bible that are quite remarkably difficult for readers. And especially for those of us who are 21st century English speaking Westerners, when we read the Bible, those readers can feel the same need of guidance so that they can really understand the message. There are a number of ways in which the Bible is distant from us. First of all, the Bible is distant from us in its language. The Bible is difficult to understand because it was written in some ancient languages. It was written in Hebrew and in Greek primarily. And of course, modern translations of the Bibles that we read are translations then from that ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek text. If you're fluent in more than one language, you know the difficulty of interpreting or translating something from one language into another. And that's the challenge that we as interpreters of the Bible face today. I'm so grateful for modern Bible translations. These Bible translations come from Bible translators and translation committees who devote their years of their lives to making sure that they have translated accurately from the original biblical language into the modern day vernacular in an understandable and readable way. But still, it's quite a challenge. Second, the Bible is challenging to interpret in that it is distant in time from us. So the events of the Bible, they happened a long time ago. The books of the Bible written about those ancient events were written a long time ago. For us in the 21st century, that's about 2,000 to 3,500 years ago. And a lot has changed in the world, of course, between then and now. And that's partly why the Bible is so challenging to interpret. The Bible does teach timeless principles, timeless truths, but it is a book that's rooted in history and in the context of ancient culture. And that antiquity challenges us to go beyond our own societal assumptions, our own presuppositions, and areas of common knowledge in order to grasp what it is saying. Third, the Bible is distant from us in geography. Even though the events of the Bible did not occur, we might say, in a galaxy far, far away, sometimes it feels like that, especially for those of you who are from America and the English-speaking world. The biblical events occurred primarily in what people today call the Middle East and the places around the Mediterranean Sea. And for some of you, that's pretty far removed from the places that you're familiar with. And because of this, often the places in the Bible can be unfamiliar to you, and that creates a challenge to interpreting it. Finally, the Bible is distant from us in its culture. The culture of the Bible can feel quite different from at least what some readers are used to, and that makes it quite a challenge to interpret. Just to give you an example, some of the ancient case laws in Israel come and are rooted in an agrarian society. They had oxen and sheep and wheat and barley. Their official transactions were rooted in ancient ways of doing business, which is unfamiliar to many today. So the point is that the Bible is pretty culturally distant from a number of biblical interpreters, and that adds to the challenge of interpreting it. Now, I want to be clear before we move on that even though there are challenges that the Bible's distance creates, still, I think those challenges can be overcome. After all, that's why we're making this video. And so I want to encourage you that even though there are a number of challenges to interpreting and understanding the Bible, it's still worth the time and the effort that it can take to understand the Bible. It is an understandable book, even with these challenges. Just one other thing I want to say before we move on, and that is the notion of biblical illiteracy. There is substantial biblical illiteracy today. A lot of readers do not understand the Bible because those readers have never read the Bible, or at least not much of the Bible. And maybe this is true for you. Perhaps you have not interacted much with the biblical message or at much depth. Perhaps you haven't grown up in a family that talked at some length about the Bible. You haven't been trained in biblical instruction. And increasingly today, the things that people like to read are things like news feeds and social media, maybe novels. But if they read anything at all, it's not going to be ancient books. People generally don't gravitate toward reading a book that's as ancient as the Bible. And so today there is rampant, and increasingly so, a rather high percentage of biblical illiteracy. And that adds to the challenge of interpreting the Bible. And yet we can still use basic principles to interpret the Bible, and that can help us bridge the gap between those distances and us today. There are two basic principles I want to talk about. First of all, the historical context. We must pay close attention to the historical context of a biblical passage. And what I mean by that is that if you're going to understand what a particular passage is saying, then it is really helpful to know the basic cultural and historical background to that passage. To give you an example, there's a rather famous story that Jesus told one time. It's popularly known as the parable of the Good Samaritan. You can find this story in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 29 through 37. In that story, there was a man who was on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. He was beaten up, he was robbed, he was left in the ditch. And then there were three men who walked by. The first two did not help him. There was a priest and it was a Levite. And then the other man, who is known as the Good Samaritan, did stop and help the man. And it was the priest and Levite who were coming from probably their temple duties in Jerusalem, and they could have assisted the man but chose not to. But it was the Good Samaritan who actually lent the helping hand. And he paid for the man's medical expenses. He took him to what we would think of as the local hospital, and he really took care of the guy. Well, that's a great story in its own right, but it actually is made even more powerful when we understand the basic historical and cultural background to that particular story. The priest and the Levite, as I mentioned a moment ago, were associated with the temple in Jerusalem. They were concerned about things like ritual purity and maintaining the animal sacrifices at the temple. On the other hand, the Samaritan was a person who lived in Israel, but wasn't Jewish, at least not ethnically, and certainly not religiously. The Jews hated the Samaritans, and the Samaritans hated the Jews. There was so much animosity between these two groups. So what we know, when we know this about the basic historical and cultural background to Jesus' story, it really adds a depth to our understanding about what Jesus was really trying to say. So my point is that when we read a biblical passage, it's best if we, as biblical interpreters, can try to put ourselves in the shoes of the original audience. And to the degree that we can do that, I think to that same degree, we can understand the biblical message even better. The second basic principle that I want to tell you about is the literary context of a biblical passage is significant for understanding its meaning. If I'm reading a novel, for instance, I'm not going to understand that novel unless I'm aware vaguely or generally of the plot of the novel. For instance, if I'm reading Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, and I decide that instead of starting at the beginning and working my way through the novel, I'm just going to read one chapter, maybe the one where Scrooge is met by the ghost of Christmas yet to come. But if I only read that one chapter, then I'm not going to understand who Scrooge is and his portrayal as a selfish and miserly old man. I'm certainly not going to understand why he's being visited by some ghost. So responsible literary analysis, just good reading, requires us to read according to a literary work's own context its plot line, its narrative structure and substructure. And so with the Bible, if you want to understand what a particular passage is trying to say, then I suggest that you should read at the very least the whole chapter in which that passage occurs. And even better, it's best if you can read the whole book in which it occurs. So to go back to Luke chapter 10 with the parable of the Good Samaritan that I mentioned a moment ago, at the very least, I would want to read the entire chapter of Luke chapter 10 in order to get a running start and then to see what's going on in the passage immediately around the parable. And of course, even better, I'd want to read the entire Gospel of Luke in order to discern how that particular parable fits in to Luke's own witness to who Jesus was and what Jesus was trying to say. So these two basic principles can go a long way, the historical and the literary context, to rightly interpreting the biblical passage. Also, I want to briefly mention some resources for interpreting the Bible. First of all, there are biblical commentaries. These are books written by biblical scholars that seek to explain what biblical passages mean. Typically, a biblical commentary focuses on one particular book of the Bible, maybe the book of Genesis, the book of Exodus, maybe the Gospel of Luke. And there are different kinds of commentaries. Some are technical, whereas others are much more devotional. The technical commentaries are where the biblical writer or the biblical scholar expects you as the reader to know some basic Hebrew or Greek, or maybe to have a basic awareness of the culture and the world of the Bible. And yet others are more devotional, much less technical, much more basic, where the scholar is trying to write to an audience and explaining the meaning of the biblical text at a basic level. And those can be very helpful. Also, other commentaries are background commentaries, where the scholar is writing about the biblical text in such a way that they want to unpack the historical and cultural background of the text for the reader. So all of these are different kinds of biblical commentaries, but I think they're helpful in their own way for you as the student to understand what a particular passage is trying to say. You know, Grand Canyon University has a number of biblical commentaries in the GCU library, both the hard print copies on the ground campus, as well as many digitally online. And I want to urge you to avail yourselves of these books as you have the opportunity. The other resource I wanted to mention for you is simply the local church. This is honestly something that I think we forget can even be a resource. Often churches have a book stall on site. When you go into the auditorium, or maybe at the foyer to the auditorium, there's a stack of recommended books that they recommend their people to read. And I think that's a helpful resource. Of course, church leaders are themselves good resources for interpretation. Often church leaders have thought deeply about how to interpret the Bible and about even the meaning of particular biblical passages. I want to say that not every church is good. Not every church leader is godly. Not every church leader is trustworthy as a biblical interpreter. So we do have to be cautious to seek out those churches that are truly Bible-loving, Bible-believing, godly churches and church leaders. But hopefully in your area there are at least some local churches and some local church leaders who can be good resources for you as you seek to understand the Bible. So I want to urge you to avail yourself of the resources offered not only by Grand Canyon University, but also by your local church. Well, I want to conclude by saying two final things. First of all, the Bible is a challenge to interpret, and yet its main message is rather clear. It is sufficiently clear for what we need to believe and practice. You know, sometimes there's an objection that people will say, look, why should I spend so much time focusing on what the Bible's trying to say, since so many biblical interpreters disagree themselves? If biblical scholars disagree among themselves, what hope do I have to understand its true meaning? So goes the objection. I want to say it is true. It is true that there are some biblical passages that are quite difficult to understand, and good Christians who love God and love one another can disagree on what those texts are trying to say. And yet, the main point of the Bible, biblical interpreters actually agree significantly on. There's remarkable agreement across Christian denominations and biblical scholars of all stripes regarding what the Bible actually teaches about who God is, what Jesus came to accomplish, the reality of humanity and human sin, the redemption that comes in Christ, how a person can be saved, so on and so forth. So I want to encourage you that even though the Bible is challenging to interpret, it is sufficiently clear to biblical interpreters, even across a wide spectrum of theological traditions. So, now that you are equipped with some basic biblical principles, the historical and literary contexts, and those resources that I mentioned for interpreting the Bible, I want to encourage you, secondly, to be a student for life. I want you to dive in and study the Bible, study the scriptures, be a student of God's Word, not just when you're a formal student, but really until the day that you die. For the rest of your life, be a student of the Bible. It is worth it. Listen, thank you for taking time to watch this video, and may the Lord bless you. May the Lord strengthen you to know and love Him through your lifelong study of the Bible.